Before we dive into the story, tell us where you're watching from. She had always trusted her ex-husband with their daughter. Years of shared parenting had built that careful balance. But when the school nurse called about suspicious marks on her little girl's arm, that trust wavered sharply. Doubt crept in, knotting in her chest in a way she hadn't felt before. What unfolded afterward wasn't a tale of clear guilt or innocence, but of a misunderstanding that nearly tore apart what little trust remained between two parents. And it all began with one small change in her daughter's behavior the night she came home. The golden afternoon light spilled through the kitchen window as she folded the last of the laundry, her thoughts already turning toward the week ahead. Sunday evenings always carried that mix of relief and low-level tension. When the front door creaked open, she expected the thump of a backpack hitting the floor and chatter about the weekend. Instead, her daughter slipped inside without a word, gaze fixed on the carpet. Transitions between homes were rarely easy. Sometimes the girl came back cranky, other times overtired. But this silence felt different. At dinner, she barely touched her food, nudging peas around her plate without eating a bite. A bath went unmentioned. Bedtime stories, too. When her mother smoothed the pajama collar, the child went still, shoulders tightening with a small instinctive flinch. Later, under the soft glow of her nightlight, the girl clenched the bedsheets until her knuckles paled. When her mother whispered, "Did something happen at Daddy's?" she only saw a faint shake of her shoulders. Children often react to transitions in different ways. Some talk it through, while others close up completely. This quiet seemed like the second kind. Heavy. Guarded. By morning, little had changed. The uniform slid on without complaint. Lunchbox zipped without protest. No silly requests for a second snack. No cartoons humming in the background. The ride to school passed in near silence. At the doorway, instead of greeting her classmates, she moved straight to her seat, folding into it like she wanted to disappear. Her mother lingered longer than usual, unsettled by the restraint that seemed stitched into every move. That morning, her phone buzzed. The school nurse introduced herself in a steady voice, the kind professionals use when a conversation could shift everything. "There appear to be some bruises we need to discuss." The words fell heavy. The car keys were already in her hand by the time the call clicked closed. She didn't yet know whether these were playground accidents or something far more troubling. And as she hurried toward the school, she braced herself for the moment when the truth would start to come into focus. The nurse's office carried an artificial warmth, the kind that didn't quite settle in. A fluorescent light buzzed overhead, flickering against the corners of the pale walls. On the low table sat a jumble of broken crayons, their wrappers peeled back. The little girl hesitated before lifting her sleeve inch by inch, as if hoping that by moving slowly enough, the bruises might stay hidden. Her mother's breath caught. Dark marks curved across her daughter's upper arm, in the shape of 3 thumbprints pressed firmly into skin. They weren't the scattered bruises of clumsy play. Their neat arc suggested something more deliberate, and the mother's chest tightened in alarm. The nurse leaned closer, her professional calm strained but intact, her hand hovering above the marks without touching. "I'm concerned about what I'm seeing," she said quietly, pulling a form from her desk drawer. Her pen hovered. This was the routine she was trained for. Schools have reporting protocols, and staff are often required to act when they see injuries that don't look accidental. The child sat rigid in the chair, eyes steady on the floor tiles. When asked gently how it happened, she shrugged, her voice absent. The silence pressed harder than words. The mother's thoughts raced. Was this a rough grab in anger? Something that had happened while changing clothes? That morning's unusual quiet now seemed heavier, filled with meaning she wished she could ignore. And yet, a thin memory tugged at her. Her ex-husband's roughhousing on the living room rug, playful but careless, his big hands sometimes leaving small red marks even when no harm was meant. He was playful, sometimes too rough, but never cruel. Could that be what she was seeing now? The nurse reached for her phone, her eyes flickering kindly toward the mother. "These should be checked by a doctor," she said, calm but firm. It wasn't exactly a question. The mother nodded, wrapping her arm around her daughter as if she could shield her from the weight of the moment. The drive to the emergency room blurred past in streaks of color and muffled reassurances. By the time the car pulled under the hospital's canopy, her hands had left small half-moon marks on the steering wheel. Inside, more eyes would take in those bruises, and more voices would decide what they suggested. The emergency room lights gave off a steady hum as the triage nurse's expression shifted the moment she saw the marks. Her latex gloves snapped into place. She turned the child's arm gently, studying the bruises from several angles. A young resident leaned in almost immediately, sharing a quick glance with her that needed no words. Behind the thin curtain, the mother caught scraps of hushed medical language. "Patterned injury," one voice said. Another added, "possible non-accidental trauma." The terms carried quiet weight, each one pressing against her ribs like a verdict. A pen light traced across the bruises, not casually, but like evidence under review. Procedures moved forward in quiet rhythm. A social worker appeared with clipboard in hand, her tone soft but steady. She explained they'd need to ask questions directly of the child, sometimes away from parents. The mother's throat tightened as a nurse guided her daughter down the hall for x-rays she couldn't join. Routine checks, they insisted, though the reassurance rang thin. Minutes later, images glowed on a monitor as the doctors conferred in low voices. No fractures, which could suggest the marks were patterned rather than accidental. And somehow that absence made the sight of those bruises stand out even more. Hospitals often follow strict procedures when staff believe a child may have been harmed. That can include alerting Child Protective Services and sometimes law enforcement, depending on what's found. A senior physician reached for the wall phone with practiced ease, setting those next steps in motion. The mother sat in the consultation room, answering questions she could barely process. No, her ex-husband had never hurt their daughter in the past. Yes, the child had been strangely quiet since coming back. No, she didn't know how this had happened. Each reply felt like tightening rope. When officers entered the ER, their neutral voices matched the clipped notes on their forms. The mother's stomach turned as one gently asked her to repeat everything again. The edges of her world blurred, the hum of their radio slicing through her thoughts. If this part resonates with you, leave a comment. It helps others feel seen. And as one officer adjusted his radio near the bedside, the real questioning was only just beginning. The officer's voice dropped low as he crouched beside the exam table, his badge catching the glow of the fluorescent lamp. "Can you tell me what happened to your arm, sweetheart?" he asked gently, as though coaxing a story from a frightened bird. The girl lowered her eyes and whispered, "I don't remember." Nearby, the mother pressed her pen to a stack of routine hospital forms that gave permission for medical photographs, her signature unsteady. Each stroke of ink felt like surrendering another piece of control. Across town, a phone buzzed against a lunch counter. The father glanced at the unknown number before swiping to answer. "This is County Social Services," a formal voice said without introduction. "We need to ask about your activities with your daughter this past weekend." His sandwich sat untouched as sharp questions followed in quick sequence. Where they had been, what kind of games they played, and whether he had noticed any injuries. Nothing in the officer's tone betrayed judgment, but every question hinted at suspicion. Allegations often fall hardest on fathers in shared custody, and many later prove unfounded. Still, for him, the weight of the conversation pressed with each measured word. He ended the call pale and restless, keys clutched in one hand, jacket trailing behind him as he tried his ex-wife's number again. Voicemail. Again. The hospital's front desk offered little more. He was told his daughter was with medical staff and that a social worker would handle questions about the visit. Those careful words felt both official and evasive. His voice faltered as he pressed for more, but there was no space to push past the barrier of procedure. He hung up with a hollow ache building in his chest. Back in the ER, the mother sat rigid as a forensic nurse adjusted the focus on her camera. The flash captured each bruise in stark detail, while an officer's notebook filled line by line with her account of the weekend. Admitting she hadn't spoken with her ex since the Friday exchange made his pen quicken. When the father finally reached the hospital, flashing patrol lights reflected against the entrance glass. A staff member met him before the doors and explained he would need to wait for the caseworker. From the hallway, he caught a brief glimpse, his daughter perched on the exam table, dwarfed by the folds of a hospital gown. an officer nearby taking notes. That image stayed with him as he was guided toward the next step. A conversation that would strip every detail down to its simplest form. The precinct's fluorescent lights buzzed above the interview table as the father leaned forward, palms flat. "We played superheroes," he said, his voice steady but tight. "She wanted to fly. My hands were right here on her arms when we spun." He lifted his fingers, holding them midair to show the grip. Across the table, the detective's eyes narrowed on the gesture. His pen paused in silence. On the desk lay the father's phone. Scrolling through the gallery, officials had already seen the images. His daughter mid-twirl, laughter wide, his palms circling her upper arms in exactly the spots the bruises later appeared. The timestamp left little doubt. The game had happened Saturday afternoon, just a day and a half before the custody exchange. He realized in that moment how small that detail had become a wedge between them. If he had mentioned it casually at drop-off, the lingering suspicion might never have taken root. A significant share of child injury cases are eventually traced back to this kind of rough play. Tumbles, spins, and wrestling games that leave marks without ill intent. On small arms, adult fingerprints can bloom into dark crescents. But without context, those marks look identical to something harsher. Drop-off that Sunday had been rushed. His daughter was distracted by the jingle of the ice cream truck, tugging free before he could linger. To him, their flying game was already folded into memory, no more noteworthy than the cartoons they watched together. He never thought those fading moments could cast such a long shadow. When the detective slid the phone back across the table, the screen still glowing with snapshots of spinning laughter, the father's shoulders sagged. The joy, frozen in pixels, stood in stark contrast to the fear circling now. Children sometimes learn to keep quiet about harmless things because they sense how those details cause their parents to argue. Silence becomes their way of protecting both sides, even as it deepens the misunderstanding. Later, the mother would be shown the same photos, finally connecting her daughter's hush with a desire to keep peace between two households. The father left the precinct with a warning to document and communicate more clearly. A new awareness of how easy it was for the simplest play to be misread. By the time evening arrived, that awareness followed both parents home, where official paperwork and tense glances would wait on the kitchen table. The final report rested between them, its stamped closure mark faint at the corner. The mother traced the edge without lifting it, as though contact alone might cement the past week into permanence. Across from her, the father cupped an empty mug, the silence between them heavier than any past argument about bedtimes. The report had ended the investigation, but rebuilding their trust would take much longer. Their daughter's bruises had already turned to pale yellow smudges. That night, while smoothing lotion on the fading marks, the mother heard the truth spill out at last. It was whispered between lines of a bedtime story, almost like a secret passed in cover of night. "Daddy's airplane game," the little girl said, followed by a small exhale, as if the words themselves lightened her chest. The mother's hand stilled on the blanket, and when she finally looked up, her ex-husband's eyes mirrored the same long release of breath. Children caught between divided homes often keep such truths tucked away. Therapists say they become careful messengers, trimming details to avoid the spark that might set off conflict. A silly game at dad's can turn into a fearful silence at mom's, not out of shame, but out of a small child's burden to protect both sides from each other. The father cleared his throat and slid a spiral notebook toward her, plain and school-like. Inside were days carefully logged, meals eaten, bedtimes kept, and, at the top of the most recent page in block letters, Sunday, played airplane outside. Got too rough. We'll check for bruises tonight. His notes about lost teeth and nightmares suddenly held weight beyond their routine. They were markers of shared understanding. The mother turned a page, then reached for her pen. She added a line about the upcoming flu shot, writing directly beside his ink instead of keeping to her side. It was a small start, the kind of practical record that gave their daughter's life one continuous thread instead of two competing halves. Outside, laughter drifted in from the yard where their daughter spun freely, her arms stretched like wings. This time she didn't flinch when friends caught her wrists mid-game. Back at the table, the parents leaned toward the same notebook, a quiet pact written in simple lines, one page at a time. And as the child's voice lifted in playful shrieks, a harder question lingered. How do you tell the difference between joy that leaves harmless marks and warning signs that shouldn't be ignored? The waiting room of the child psychologist carried the faint smell of hand sanitizer and crayons worn down to stubs. Dr. Liang often reminded parents that not every silence signals trouble, but some silences carry weight. Ask, then listen. Start with the body. Fatigue from long weekends looks ordinary. Droopy eyes, yawns at the dinner table. But protective postures tell a different story. A child folding their arms over soft areas like inner arms or thighs. A clear line of fingerprints, dark and round, rarely comes from playground falls. Those are details worth pausing on. Behavior tells its own version. A child might chatter freely about cartoons, but freeze when asked about one household. Selective silence that appears only when a certain parent's name comes up isn't routine adjustment. It's caution. Notice if your child is playing peacekeeper. That's a red flag. A 6-year-old shouldn't feel responsible for balancing grown-up arguments. Nighttime magnifies what's hidden during the day. Healthy tiredness leads to snoring in the back seat or dozing before lights out. But sudden bedwetting or waking from nightmares with specific images, a basement, a loud figure, signal stress too sharp to ignore. Sleep often tells the truth faster than words. Drawings can do the same. Professionals sometimes see pages covered with outsized hands looming near smaller bodies or wide gaps between figures. If you see something like that, gently ask, "Can you tell me about this person in your picture?" The answer might be simple, or it might open the door to something waiting beneath the surface. The strongest guide remains a simple approach. Notice. Ask. Then listen. Not every bruise or silence carries a hidden story, but brushing past those signals means you risk missing the ones that matter. Children often test whether it's safe to speak, and your response, steady, patient, unhurried, tells them more than questions alone ever could. For this family, the warning signs became a lesson. Small clues mattered, but so did the tools they used afterward. What they built next wasn't just about easing suspicion. It was about giving their daughter a safe space where her world could stay connected, even while divided. The notebook began simply, tucked in her backpack with its navy cover scuffed at the corners. At first, it was just a running log, brief lines passed between two homes. Date, short note. Activity, any bumps, sleep or appetite changes. What started as plain record keeping soon became their shared ground. Tuesday, skinned knee from scooter fall, left leg, bandaged. Wednesday, nightmare about spiders, extra hug needed. Her mother's careful script filled the even pages. The father's bold print marked the odds. Family counselors often say tools like this can soften conflict by turning uncertainty into clarity. It worked here. No more late-night texts about unexplained bruises. No need to read into quiet moods. The book carried only facts. Saturday, played superheroes again, held arms lighter this time, leaving less space for suspicion to fill in gaps. Gradually, transitions began to shift. At drop-off, the daughter still twirled her arms like wings. But now her mother simply nodded solemnly, while her father gave a quick tap to his bicep, a shorthand promise that he'd be gentle. That one small gesture captured what had changed. Where doubt once stood, they'd built a signal of trust. Over time, the entries grew lighter. What opened with injury reports grew into notes about cartwheels landed or new words spelled out at school. The mother began adding small joys she once would have kept to herself. The father jotted reminders about groceries, confident she'd add his cereal to the list when their daughter stayed with her. The practical had become personal, a steady exchange. Therapists often describe co-parenting as two adults working beside each other, but not quite together. This family learned to share instead of divide. By the back pages, the notebook held birthday plans and holiday schedules. Their daughter even added her own notes in uneven handwriting. Mom got snack. Dad forgot water. It wasn't polished, but it was proof. She no longer guarded her words out of worry for how they'd sound. At the last pickup, the mother wrote only one line. No notes this week. just her. The father grinned as he zipped it into the bulging backpack. The notebook didn't fix everything, but it gave them a way to share their child's life without suspicion. And it left open the question every parent in their position must face. How do you keep trust alive? Page after page. The Navy notebook still travels between homes, though now its pages hold more reminders and grocery lists than incidents. For this family, it became more than paper. It was a steady place to share the everyday. It can help to choose curiosity over suspicion and to keep simple records between households. Ask one question, write one note, and then listen. If you've navigated something similar, leave a comment. Your experience could help someone else. For more real-life looks at modern families finding their way, subscribe. Until then, may your notebooks grow lighter.